Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome to part 2 of my favorite books of 2020. I'm very excited to dive into this, so without further ado, let's dive right in. I have read a lot of really good books this year, and I wanted to share my top 5 reads of the year. This is part 2 of my top 10 reads, so without further ado, let's dive right in. The first book on this list is Beautiful Boy by David Sheff. This book I've talked about on my channel as part of my Mind and Art series, and I started reading this book this year because I really wanted to learn more about addiction and how addiction, specifically drug addiction, affects families and people involved, as well as the person who is addicted. And I very much had heard about this book and I wanted to read it. I also watched the movie, which I do recommend, although there are some differences. But I definitely think that both the movie and the book are great representations of what it is like to know someone who struggles with drug addiction. This book is really remarkable because of the way in which it delves into the science of addiction and the way in which it deals with a father's discoveries about addiction as he investigates and as he tries to understand what it is like. David is trying to understand what his son is going through, as it is his son who is struggling with addiction, and I definitely think that it is a remarkable theme to capture in this book, and I think this book captures these elements very well. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to read this book. It will definitely open your perspective on what addiction is and what it feels like to go through it, and yeah, I definitely recommend it. The next book on my list is The Power of Babel by John McWhorter. This is a very interesting book, the way in which it talks about the science of language, or at least linguistics, where there are a lot of elements to language that we don't necessarily think about. One of the things that I find most remarkable about this book is the way in which McWhorter talks about language in the context of everyday experience, and how languages definitely evolve. One of the most important contributions that I think he makes in this book is describing language as not necessarily being standard, as they're not, for example, being a standard English. And I think that that is definitely a powerful theme, to realize that language really is multifaceted and is constantly changing, and that it definitely represents different features of what it means to be human and to be alive and to be people that use language. This book is interesting because of the way in which it links the study of language with politics. I don't want to spoil that, so I encourage you to check out the book. But I definitely am very much inspired by these notions that language is very flexible and that it evolved with humans to be able to do a number of things that I think that is easy to take for granted because we use language all of the time and because we don't always think about it. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to check it out. The next book that I wanted to talk about is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Currently I am reading Lord of the Rings, which is the trilogy by Tolkien, and right now I'm currently reading The Two Towers, but I had to put The Fellowship of the Ring on this list because of its influence. I think that The Fellowship of the Ring as a book is very remarkable. It is amazing the world building that Tolkien develops and that he brings into his writing, and you definitely find yourself caring about these characters. Even though I don't know how these books conclude, although I'm familiar with it enough because I've seen the movies, I would say that this book has kept me on the edge of my seat. This trilogy of books has kept me on the edge of my seat, and I had to include The Fellowship of the Ring for its artistic appeal and the amazing things that Fellowship of the Ring captures. There is definitely a lot of beauty in The Fellowship of the Ring as a book, and I definitely recommend it, not just for the fantasy and the stories and the escape, but also for the language and the beauty of the ideas involved in the book and the characters. So yeah, a very iconic book, but I had to include it. So yeah, I hope that you will check it out sometime if you haven't read it. Another book that I was definitely moved by this year is The Divided Self by R.D. Laing. I wanted to read this book because I wanted to understand more about mental illness, and I think that mental illness is something that is often misunderstood in society, and Laing always had a very compassionate approach to those who experienced mental illness, such as schizophrenia as an example. And he had this specific viewpoint because he was experiencing mental illness in some capacity for himself. I thought about this book and discovered it whenever I was watching Sisyphus 55 on YouTube, who has a special episode about R.D. Laing and his books, and specifically talking about the divided self, so I had to pursue it, and I'm very glad that I did. R.D. Laing is definitely a very compassionate soul with the way that he looks at those suffering from mental illness, and it is really remarkable how he describes that we often split from our own self because we are unable to deal with the difficulties of stigma, the pressures of modern life, and the way in which it is easy for us to lose track of ourselves and to repress too much of ourselves in the world through civilization and through these kind of forced moralities that we find ourselves in. I'm very glad that R.D. Laing is super compassionate with his writing, and I'm glad that he understands mental illness in a very deep way. Many people do not talk about mental health and mental illness because of the stigma, but I'm very glad that R.D. Laing was able to describe a lot of these things. And I find this book to be very valuable for that reason. I also included R.D. Laing's book as an episode as part of my Mind and Art series, which is one of my favorite videos that I've made to date on my YouTube channel, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. The final book on this list is The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier. I had to include this book as my top read because I found it to be very, very interesting in a variety of ways, and I was very glad that I was able to read it. This book has been recommended to me since I was at least a teenager, whenever I was in junior high. And the book was recommended because of the way in which it depicts human nature and the way that humans are, and the way in which the writing is very intense but also very well done. I don't want to give away the plot. I do talk about this book in another episode on my YouTube channel. I talk about it as a book review on my channel, so I definitely encourage you to check out that video. But suffice to say, this book I often contrast with Lord of the Flies by William Golding because of its depictions of human nature and what people go through. But what I will say is this: Jerry was a very innocent and good character. He was someone who was very compassionate in his own way, and who was also I would describe as a gentle soul, even if he was also very tough in other ways. And he basically gets railroaded by the characters in this book, by the vigils, and by teachers who are not good role models. And I really like this book because it resonates with me with thinking about human nature and those who try to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. I think that it's very difficult to do such a thing, but it is certainly my hope that we can continue to represent some kind of goodness, some kind of good nature, regardless of the cruelty and wickedness happening around us. And so yeah, I find this book to be very remarkable. So I encourage you to check it out. It's a young adult novel, and this book was written before dystopian young adult, so it definitely has a different flavor to it than we might expect from young adult nowadays. But I very much found the writing to be top quality, and I found the book to be very interesting and remarkable for a variety of reasons. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. So yeah, I was very excited to be able to talk about these books on my two-part series of my favorite reads of 2020. I did want to mention two honorable mentions because even though they didn't make this list, they were very influential to me this year for their own reasons. That includes Dhalgren by Samuel Delany, as well as 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. So I definitely encourage you to check out those books. I was very glad that I was able to invest in those books. Those books were 1,000 pages plus, and they definitely involved a lot of attention that you had to give them. They were very demanding, but I think for those reasons and more, those books were worth mentioning. And so yeah, I hope you will check it out. I also encourage you to check out the other playlists on my YouTube channel, including this playlist that deals with my favorite books that I've been reading, and that includes book reviews. So yeah, I encourage you to check it out. I'm Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed my discussion of my favorite reads of 2020. There will be much more content to come, so keep a lookout. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.